In November 1971, excitement coursed through the veins of the group of students from Ainslie Park School as they hiked their way through the stunning terrain of Scotland's vast Cairngorm Plateau. But little did this group of 17 know that what started as a thrilling annual excursion would rapidly spiral into a series of progressively worse events, culminating in a heart-wrenching tragedy that would shake their worlds to the core. Known for its breathtaking beauty, brutal weather, and unique biodiversity, the plateau promised an unforgettable experience. But this journey would test their endurance, challenge their survival skills, and ultimately lead to a desperate fight for life in Britain's worst mountaineering accident. As we dive in, a quick heads up. What you're about to hear is quite intense, so viewer discretion is advised. This story is so harrowing that it quite literally changed excursion and mountaineering protocols across the United Kingdom permanently. After you see what happened, I think you'll see why that had to be done. The United Kingdom is one of the most industrialized places in the world, and a consequence of that is less wild, untouched nature. Most of the land across the UK is cultivated or privately owned, and the forests that do exist are typically managed and maintained. You won't find any big sandy deserts or large inland lakes, and even the wildest places, well, aren't truly wild anymore. Even in parks and reserves, where you're meant to be close to nature, you are just a couple of conveniences away from civilization. But the Scottish Cairngorms, they really stand out as maybe the last true bit of wilderness left in the UK. This huge national park is the biggest in Britain and is named after its highest peak, Cairn Gorm. It's a haven for outdoor enthusiasts with trails for hiking, climbing routes, campsites, rivers for kayaking, and paths for biking. Home to a quarter of the UK's rare and endangered species, it's also the only place where you can spot the last free-ranging herd of reindeer on the island. Reindeer of the deer family, not the Santa and flying sleigh variety, in case you were curious. For years, parents have sent their kids on an annual adventure to Britain's last wild lands, trusting the experienced leaders to keep everyone safe. Unfortunately, in November of 1971, what began as an educational outing turned into every parent's worst nightmare. It all began well enough on that chilly November morning, as 14 eager students and their 3 teachers from Ainslie Park School congregated, ready to embark on a 2-day navigational trek across the plateau. With the majestic and challenging Cairngorm Mountains in the background, this trek was meant to test their mountaineering knowledge and outdoor training education. For the students, this little field trip was nothing more than a quaint little adventure across real wilderness, and the whole group looked forward to exploring this vast, wild area, known for its stunning landscapes, but also for its unpredictable weather. In the weeks leading up to their mountain adventure, the plan was to thoroughly train the students in essential mountaineering techniques. Ideally, they would have mastered things like step kicking for climbing up steep slopes, how to step down carefully on steep descents, and how to slide down slopes sitting down safely. They were also supposed to have mastered stopping themselves if they started to slide down the mountain unexpectedly, along with receiving comprehensive first aid training to manage emergencies effectively while isolated in the mountains. Unfortunately, the training they received wasn't as thorough as it needed to be. They were only briefly shown these skills, leaving them underprepared for the tough conditions they were about to face. In preparing for the trip, the students were equipped with gear that should have been suitable for the cold mountain weather. Equipment and specialized clothing was supplied by the outdoor center responsible for their climb, although the teens brought their own pants and sweaters. They carried items like carabiners, which help secure ropes, harnesses for safety, and a stove for cooking. They were also given sleeping bags meant for extreme cold, large tarps for emergency shelters, and first aid kits. However, advanced safety equipment was missing or insufficient. The leaders thought this was going to be a short trip up the mountains. They were fatally wrong. Ideally, they also should have been equipped with helmets and signal locating devices from the start, which are crucial for safety on steep terrain, but who was going to give a couple of teenagers such expensive equipment for what was supposed to be a short school trip? In any matter, what they truly lacked was the experience to be out in the conditions they would soon face. And so as they set out, the group was unknowingly under-equipped and lacking the comprehensive training that could have made a significant difference in their ability to safely navigate and survive the Cairn Gorm's brutal mountain. This gap in preparation would soon become horrifyingly apparent. The journey to the mountains began under the leadership of Ben Beatty, a 23-year-old chief instructor in outdoor education at Ainslie Park School and an experienced mountaineer. Although seasoned in fair weather conditions, this trip would test his expertise beyond its limits. Accompanying Beatty was his 20-year-old girlfriend, Catherine Davidson, a fellow enthusiast and physical education student who, although she had less overall mountaineering experience, had visited the Cairn Gorms in the winter twice, making her the only adult in the group with actual winter Cairn Gorm mountaineering experience. The other leader that was part of the group was 18-year-old Sheila Sunderland, a volunteer instructor with no experience in the Cairn Gorms who was just starting a 3-week voluntary stint as a teacher at Edinburgh Education Authority's Outdoor Centre. This group of 3 were meant to oversee 14 young students between the ages of 14 and 18 who were going to be learning navigational skills using maps and compasses for the first time, through what was intended to be a controlled educational scenario. Months after the incident, questions would be raised over why the school would sanction such a risky expedition without ensuring adequate experienced oversight and considering the extreme potential weather conditions of the Cairn Gorms during winter. But on that November morning, no eyebrows were raised over the possible safety of the trip, and off the group went. The majesty of the terrain here is truly breathtaking. This mountain range, the largest in the British Isles, is a high-altitude wonderland, rising over 4,000 feet at its highest peaks like Ben Macdui. One of the more unique features about this mountain range is its flat, plateau-like tops, which is quite different from the sharp and jagged mountain peaks usually found elsewhere in the world. While the Cairn Gorms are relatively easy to climb, the length, distance, and sheer change in weather across the plateau mountain tops makes it rank as one of the most challenging range for climbers in the United Kingdom. Snow can fall at any time during the year, and snow patches stick around all summer. One of the biggest challenges in the Cairn Gorms is the weather, which can be extremely unpredictable and change rapidly, especially as you go higher. The plateau area often experiences severe snowstorms, strong winds, and sudden drops in temperature, which can be dangerous even for the most experienced mountaineers. This makes navigation really challenging, as visibility can decrease dramatically within minutes. On such a big mountain range, getting lost is easy, for some almost even inevitable. Because of this, there are temporary shelters installed to protect travelers and hikers separated far from their group or who get trapped in a storm on the mountains. These small rudimentary huts are known as bothies and are dotted around the hills of the range. Bothies can also be used as meeting areas or stopping off points on multi-day hikes. And the higher you go, the more important they become. As temporary structures, they are nothing fancy, just several very basic shelters made of metal sheeting, mud, and stone. One of these shelters, the Curran Bothy in particular, would become a very important part of this expedition story. On the 19th of November, the 14 students and their teachers arrived at the Laganlia Outdoor Centre in the Cairn Gorms. The Outdoor Center was no stranger to hosting outdoor groups of students seeking to climb the mountains. And this was where the third leader, 18-year-old Sheila Sunderland, joined the group. To have easier control over the hike, the teenagers were divided in advance into 2 groups, with the more advanced ones designated to Beatty, while Catherine and Sheila took care of the others. The plan was simple. Both groups were to cross the plateau from Cairn Gorm south to Ben Macdui, the peak of Cairn Gorm Mountains, with the whole journey meant to wrap up within 48 hours. Ideally, this should have been a 10.5-mile hike, which would be a challenging trek for the group, most of whom were only 15 years old. But they were excited for it, unaware of the grave challenges ahead that would turn this educational expedition into a nightmare. That Saturday morning, the group leaders submitted their planned route journey to the principal of Laganlia, and even included a solution where, in the case of horrible weather, it was expected that both parties cut short their expedition and seek shelter at Cairn Gorm. Their plan was approved. The group continued to plan to reach the summit. The temperatures may have been dropping, but so far, the weather was stable and calm. While the weather forecast predicted terrible conditions that day, Ben Beatty and Catherine Davidson had decided the climb could be completed safely anyway before the bad weather hit. This was the beginning of several fatal mistakes. The trip started with problems from the beginning. First, the trek started much later than they planned, at around 11 a.m., which meant they didn't have much daylight left to complete their hike. If you've ever done serious hiking in the mountains, you know that typically you want to be at the summit of your climb no later than noon because bad weather will hit by 1 p.m. at the latest. This group hadn't even started till 11 that morning. To make up for lost time, they ascended up the Cairn Gorm mountains via a ski lift, hoping to save some precious daylight hours. Sunset in November was just before 4 o'clock. After reaching and crossing the plateau, both groups were to descend separately. The Catherine Davidson group was supposed to return along the Lairg Gru, while the Beatty group would return by traversing Cairn Tool and Breariash on the far side of the valley. In case of an emergency, the plan for both groups, like I mentioned earlier, was to make it to the Cairn Gorm, a safe spot at a much lower level in the Lairg Gru, where they would spend the night. Ben Beatty's group, with the more experienced hikers, moved quickly ahead, handling the rough paths better because of their skills. Catherine Davidson's group, which included 6 younger students who weren't as experienced, followed behind at a slower pace. Shortly after the group set off on their journey across the Cairngorm Plateau, the weather turned just as predicted, worsening rapidly. Ben's group encountered severe difficulties due to the weather. As they reached Coir Domahan, the increasing winds and heavy, soft snow significantly slowed their progress and reduced visibility. Recognizing the growing danger they were in, Beatty decided to divert to the alternative safe route, aiming for Cairn Gorm as a safer overnight point. They arrived at the bothy around 3:30 p.m. Once there, they had to clear away snow which had piled up at the entrance just to access the door, before settling in for what was sure to be a long, cold night. But despite the harsh conditions outside, Ben's group felt secure in the shelter. They waited for hours, expecting to see the footprints of Catherine's crew outside as well, seeking refuge in this bothy as planned. However, Catherine Davidson's group did not reach the shelter. Beatty, who had considerable experience climbing and mountaineering in various rugged terrains such as Ireland, the Alps, and the Scottish West Coast, initially thought Davidson's group might have chosen a different, possibly easier path to a different shelter. This misjudgment about Davidson's group's whereabouts was another mistake that would ultimately lead to fatal outcomes as the weather conditions continued to deteriorate. As the night progressed, the conditions around Beatty's group's bothy worsened significantly. The snow piled up so high against the door that, come morning, they struggled just to get it open. In a resourceful move, the smallest boy in the group was helped through a partially open door to clear the snow from the outside, enabling everyone else to exit. Throughout the ordeal, Beatty was deeply concerned for the safety of Catherine Davidson's group, which had still not arrived at the shelter. Faced with a tough decision, Beatty weighed the risks of searching for the missing group against the urgency of moving his own group to a safer location, down into Lairg Gru. His primary intention for the expedition had never been to challenge the children's physical limits, but rather to provide an educational experience in the wilderness. This unexpected turn of events forced him into a critical role, balancing the safety of his present group with the responsibility for the missing members. Emerging from the shelter after a difficult night, Beatty's group struggled to make their way down from the plateau due to the deep snow, facing harsh conditions that made their descent quite challenging. There were many falls and slips along the way, and one boy even almost got seriously injured. But once they finally managed to navigate off the plateau and reached the relative safety of the Lairg Gru, Beatty was able to make contact with the Laganlia Outdoor Center. It was then he discovered that Catherine Davidson's group had not yet returned, heightening his concern. As evening fell around 4:30 of their second day on the mountain, Beatty's group reached the Rothimercus hut, a housing facility down the mountains where they were able to make a phone call to Laganlia and coordinate their transportation. By 5:30, they met their transport vehicle and the students were safely returned to Laganlia. However, with no news of Davidson's group, Beatty continued on to the ski center and then to Glenmore Lodge and to a police station down the slope. By 7 that night, with Davidson's party still unaccounted for, they officially reported the group as missing. This action triggered an immediate response. Teams of rescuers braved the blizzard and darkness, setting out to search for the missing party. Additional mountain rescue teams from Cairn Gorm, RAF Kinloss, Braemar, and Aberdeen were also called into action. These teams coordinated and prepared on Sunday night, so they could begin their search operations in earnest before the first light of Monday, hoping to locate the missing hikers amid the challenging conditions. Back on the mountain, Catherine Davidson's group was in trouble, and they knew it. Initially, after splitting from Beatty's group, they faced a demanding route. The plan had been clear. They were to leave the car park at 11 a.m., ascend to the 4,000-foot summit of Cairn Gorm within an hour and a half, move on to Lochan Bwidi in 2 hours, climb 500 feet to Ben McDoohey in roughly 1.25 hours, descend to Taylor's Burn in 1 hour, and then travel through Lairig Gru to reach Curran Bothy in another half hour. The entire trek was scheduled to take roughly 6.5 hours, ideally ending at Curran Bothy by 5:15 p.m. However, as they ventured deeper onto the route, the conditions worsened. With the weather deteriorating rapidly into a full-on blizzard, the trek grew increasingly challenging. The intended timings began to falter as they encountered unexpected delays, complicating their navigation and progress. Each segment of the hike took longer than planned, reducing their buffer against the encroaching evening cold and diminishing light, pushing them into a precarious situation far from the safety of Curran Bothy. With only about 4 hours of daylight remaining, the group had to navigate 6 tough miles to reach their planned shelter. The journey was complicated by strong winds, a common hazard in mountainous terrains, which can turn even straightforward treks into dangerous endeavors. This particular weekend, the situation worsened as the snow was unusually powdery, preventing the group from digging effective shelters or holes for protection. The combination of powdery snow and biting wind infiltrated their equipment and sleeping materials, stripping away their insulating properties and triggering a chilling cycle of cold and wetness that was hard to break. For 6 children stranded on the Cairn Gorm, amid the worst blizzard to hit the mountains for years, this would prove fatal. On that fateful Saturday afternoon, in the middle of the raging blizzard, Catherine Davidson made the critical decision to abandon the planned route. The deteriorating weather and the students' growing distress prompted her to seek an alternative path. Rather than heading straight for the Curran shelter, she attempted to navigate downhill, hoping to find a different shelter nearby. Unfortunately, the snow had obliterated the location of the shelters nearby, making it impossible to find, and ultimately forcing Davidson to abandon hope of reaching Curran. Faced with no other options, Davidson decided to prepare for a bivouac in an area that was, unbeknownst to her, prone to heavy snow accumulation. This decision was later criticized by John Duff, leader of the Braemar Mountain Rescue Team, who noted that attempting a winter bivouac in such conditions on the Cairngorm Plateau was extremely risky and should only be considered as a last resort. Duff also reflected on the overall expedition planning, deeming it appallingly overambitious for teenagers and placing responsibility on those who planned and approved the trip. As night fell, the group huddled together in sleeping bags and bivouac sacks, using a snow wall for some protection from the elements. Initially, they managed to maintain their spirits. However, as the snow continued to pile up, panic set in due to the fear of being buried alive. By Sunday morning, the situation had become dire. One boy was heard shouting from beneath the snow, and Sheila Sunderland was barely conscious. Despite an attempt by Catherine Davidson and one of the boys to go for help, The overwhelming snow forced them back, leaving them with little option but to wait, trapped and increasingly desperate. Throughout that Sunday, the blizzard showed no mercy, and as night enveloped the mountains, the group could faintly see search party flares in the distance. Despite their efforts to signal for help, their voices were swallowed by the howling wind, and their own emergency flares had been lost to the snow. That second night on the mountains was especially harrowing, as the teenagers became increasingly delirious from the cold, with their situation growing even worse by the hour. By dawn on Monday, the grim reality set in. Most of the party were either completely or partially buried under the snow, with some members likely already deceased. Catherine Davidson, pushed to her absolute limits, and on the verge of collapse, knew she had to make one last attempt to save herself and the others. Meanwhile, back at the mountain base, Beatty and another leader, Paisley, had continued their efforts to gather information at the ski center, Glenmore Lodge, and the Aviemore police station, and mountain rescue teams from Cairngorm, RAF Kinloss, Braemar, and Aberdeen prepared for an extensive search starting before dawn on Monday. The search efforts intensified under stormy conditions. On Monday, November 22, 1971, despite the adverse weather, about 50 men, supported by helicopters, scoured the area. The Braemar Mountain Rescue Team approached from the south, reaching Curran-Bathy only to find it empty. But a significant breakthrough occurred around 10:30 that morning when a helicopter from RAF spotted Davidson, who was desperately crawling on her hands and knees across the plateau. The visibility of her bright orange jacket against the stark white snow caught the pilot's attention. The helicopter managed to get close enough to unload 2 crew members who then reached Davidson. She was unable to walk, her legs locked in a kneeling position, and she was airlifted to safety in a precarious operation, made a lot harder by the blinding snow kicked up by the helicopter. Davidson was transported by helicopter and then taken by ambulance to a hospital. Despite being in the advanced stages of hypothermia and confusion, she provided vital clues about the location of the rest of her party, uttering just a few words. Burn, Lochan, buried. These clues directed the search teams to the exact site of the tragedy. John Cunningham from Glenmore Lodge, along with Beatty and Paisley, were the first to reach the tragic scene, where they discovered the bodies of the 6 students and the assistant, buried deep under the snow. All had tragically died except for one, Raymond Leslie, who was still breathing and was immediately tended to by a doctor. Later, a Royal Navy Sea King helicopter, guided by the leader of the RAF Kinloss MRT using flares, was able to airlift Leslie to Regmore Hospital for urgent care. Sadly, Sheila Sunderland, Carol Bertram, Susan Byrne, Lorraine Dick, William Kerr, and Diane Dudgeon did not survive, their lives claimed by one of the most severe blizzards the Cairngorms had seen. Of their group, only Catherine Davidson and Raymond Leslie survived this horrifying ordeal, marking it as one of the darkest days in British mountaineering history. An inquiry held early the following year, after the Cairngorm Plateau disaster, uncovered several critical errors in planning and execution of the hike. It was determined that the challenging nature of the hike was not suitable for children of such young ages, especially considering the harsh weather conditions forecasted for that day. The inquiry criticized the decision to start the hike late in the day and the use of the chairlift, which hindered the group's ability to properly assess the walking conditions early enough to avoid danger. Recommendations from the inquiry stressed the need for outdoor activity leaders to be formally certified, ensuring they possessed the necessary experience to guide such expeditions safely. Furthermore, it suggested that hikes should be meticulously planned with the participants' age and experience level in mind, particularly when involving children. While the inquiry did not blame any single individual, it did raise questions about the effectiveness of emergency shelters like the Curran-Bathy. The shelter had been a key goal for hikers, potentially encouraging them to continue in bad conditions rather than turning back. After much debate, it was decided to demolish the current bothy, aiming to balance safety with the developmental benefits of adventurous outdoor activities. Today, the Cairn Gorms continue to be a popular destination, frequented by schools and thousands of visitors annually. The Leganlia Center still hosts school trips, but with enhanced safety protocols, ensuring that all leaders are certified and trained to a rigorous standard. While minor incidents still occur, the measures taken have successfully prevented another tragedy of the scale of the Cairngorm Plateau disaster. So in a sense, I guess some good still came out of the tragedy in the end. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.